gone down the next one. I said, you've got to start seeing him as a normal kid.
Miles away from here. He attended a one-room schoolhouse for public school, and he went to Walkerton for high school. He went to the University of Waterloo for his undergrad, and he went to the University of Western Ontario to get his law degree. He returned to Bruce County in 1978. He's got a law office in Paisley. He's a local historian. You might have seen him in our movie, The Bruce. And he's very graciously agreed over the years to do presentations for the Genealogical Society on Irish genealogy and German genealogy. And so I ask you to welcome Pat Kelly.
A couple of public service announcements before we get into the main go here. Number one, a big shout out to Robin, thank you. Robin's doing me a very big favor. My mom is not too mobile, so the photo stuff is basically just share a little something with her, so thank you, Robin. There are a couple of other things in this presentation. One of them is throughout I've tried to use German sources. I've tried as much as I can to make it topical from the time that the various people were coming here. I'm going to ask a quick question here. Was anybody here from either Mennonite or Amish tradition? Okay, good. Do we have any Waterloo County expatriates via Maryhill or places like that? Okay. Any later Germans coming through? Okay, there are, so two disclaimers. One is, in certain cases, I've had to use Irish quotes. The accents are different, but the experience was the same. So it will tell you the story about the time, and that's kind of the plan here. There are two other disabilities we will talk about. One is, it's always a challenge to talk to a crowd after they've been well fed and somebody's cranked the heat up. So periodically I will play music just to sort of prevent the natural inclines, but if you fall asleep, that's all right. The other thing is that famously John F. Kennedy in 1961, I believe, at the time the Berlin Wall went up, went over and did a very famous speech in Berlin, and what happened on the way over were that his associates were trying to teach him German to a man with a very thick Boston accent. So it was sort of an indifferent result in the sense that he finally got out with Ich bin ein Berliner, which means I am a donut. Now the Berliners looked puzzled, but at the same time they sort of cheered wildly and everybody was very happy about the fact. So as I'm going through this, and some of my pronunciations may not quite be what they should be, please bear with me. It's not from anything other than the fact that I don't speak German and I'm giving it my best shot. So, in June of 1960, my father had put the hay rack on the wagon, and we were going to my grandmother's place in Chepstow, and we were taking her a bunch of wood. The deal was that this was the good stuff. This is hard maple, this is ash, this is beech, and that stuff is going to burn hotter and longer and keep a nice bed of coals, so that when my grandmother woke up in the morning, the ice hadn't formed on the water pail. And so we headed off. I was 7 coming on 8, and so off we go. We threw all the wood off. The woodshed is behind us right here. And he said two things. Okay, you're going to stack it all, do it the way I showed you, and make sure it doesn't fall down. And with those words of encouragement, he was gone. And I looked at that enormous pile of wood, and I knew despair. And then sort of the Irish quotation, a field never got plowed by turning it over in your mind, so we started stacking wood. About an hour and a half in, my grandmother came out with some strawberry freshie to replenish the hard-working one here. And there were two things that were singular about it. In all the time, the 35 years that I can remember her, this is the only time that it was just her and I speaking, which sort of makes sense if you look at the 10 children that are looking here and eventually the 37 grandchildren. I was also pretty sure that nobody was going to show up until I had all the wood stacked. So I knew that she had been a German speaker at the time she started into grade school. And I started to ask her a few questions. And I said, okay, speak some German. Brot, bread, mini, milk, macht die Tür zu. Shut the door. 15 seconds in, and I'm giving orders in German. I thought, this is great. You know, half an hour, I'll be fluent and cause torment to my brothers. It'll be all good. She talked about growing up, and to give you the backstory, her family were Kaufmans. They were from the 10th. Originally, they had settled over in Bentinck Township. They eventually bought a place on the 10th of Brant, and she attended the Eden Grove School, which, if any of you remembers back in the old days, if you remember Ducky's Takeout on number 3 Highway, that was the Eden Grove School. So that's about 2.5 miles from where their farm was. She talked about the jarring kind of adjustment to being a German speaker and suddenly having to learn English for the first time. She talked about her father, and he would read to her with a German newspaper, and she remembered April of 1912, because what he's talking about was the Titanic. And she talked about him saying, oh, those poor people. We talked about the fact, did my grandfather speak German? Yes, he did, but he spoke a different dialect. We couldn't understand one another. And I'm thinking, there's more than one German? How is that possible? So the tradition never carried on to the next generation. Then she talked about something, said 1914 was a very bad year. So my father died, and the First World War broke out. And we're going to come back to that because it has a direct influence on all the people who have German background around here. If you came to Canada, or your ancestors did in the 1830s and 40s, a good part of that was because of this fellow, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon was a bit of a star. French Revolution, 1789. I'm not going to get you with a lot of dates and times, but there are a couple little background pieces, because if you talk about when you drop a pebble into the mill pond and the ripples go out forever, Napoleon was dropping 120-pound rocks, and those convolutions are a good reason why, if anybody's from the Maryhill bunch, that's probably why you're here. Napoleon, 1789 French Revolution, his final downfall, 1815. Europe had almost 25 years of straight warfare. They get tired every once in a while, they'd stop for a while and then go back at it again. The reason it's significant, and I will not take a lot of time on this, there was a very famous battle that he was at, which was called Austerlitz, and it has a significance for all of you, or at least the Maryhill crowd. If you've ever seen a killdeer in a field, if you've ever picked stones and you know what it's like, if you get close to the nest, the mother goes and does the broken wing thing and tries to draw you out. That's what Napoleon did here. He desperately he was basically up against the combined armies of Austria and Russia. He was undermanned by about 20,000 people. He let on, please don't attack me, meaning please attack me here. I've made it so that this is not going to happen. He coordinated 6 separate pieces to work just exactly the way it was supposed to be. So they did what they were supposed to. They attacked him just about the time they're going to fail. 7,000 fresh troops come in from 41 miles away because he knew that at 3 o'clock in the afternoon he would need them. And they stabilized the line. Short version, he drew more people off. He cracked right up the middle. He beat both of those armies. The following year he beat the Prussians, and there was nobody in the entire continent of Europe to oppose him. He was a winner and still champion. So Napoleon had, at this point, a number of these loose little allies, and the allies were all along the Rhine River. So what happened was they started weighing the options. Okay, we can't beat this guy. Napoleon also did something, wars are expensive. So what he did was he fined the Austrians 100 million francs. And all the guys along the German border said, ooh, this guy wins, and tell me more about the 100 million francs. So all of a sudden they all became allies, and we're going to come back to that in a bit. Around the time of Austerlitz, that was all our crowd. Vive la France. Okay, so they're saying, we want to, all the people living along the Rhine, this is the Rhine River, all these little countries, all these little principalities, all said, we want to be with him. So if you go up the line and you follow the Rhine River, you're going to see Bavaria. That's my Hines. Baden, my Fischers. If you go across the way, the Waiters. If you go a little further north, you've got where the Hines came from originally. You have all these little places talking to people along the way here. Palatine, Nassau, up into the northern part. If you see Hessen, that's the Kaufmanns. All along the Rhine River, all these little groups said, we're with you. There was a cost to that. Napoleon said, that's great, you get to be our allies, but you're going to give us troops. Specifically, these guys had to give him 68,000 troops. In addition, the guys across the river, right here in Alsace-Lorraine, were part of the French territory. They're about another 12,000. So there's about 80,000 troops in Napoleon's army. They're all German speakers. Why is that important? Napoleon decided in 1812 to go into Russia. And all of those people got dragged along. And those people, 630,000 went in, 27 organized, 27,000 came out, another 100,000 came out frostbitten, half starved, and that was the end of Napoleon. Why is it important? One of the conditions, you can see here the gentle times that they were having as they retreated from Moscow. As they retreated from Moscow, they burned the whole city. They found their way back, trudging over 1,100, 1,200 miles. And at the end of it, Napoleon's down. Here's the problem. Wars are expensive. So Napoleon's problem was, he's gone now. All those countries, France, all of the little principalities along the way are broke. There's no work. If you are a Finnish carpenter, if you're a cabinet maker, if you have anything, there's nobody wants you to work. There were too many people there, so if you're a farmer, you can't rent because there's no land to rent. In some of the other ethnic groups that came to Bruce County, the Scots were fairly well defined, the Highland clearances, a good portion of them there. The Irish was simple, a famine. With the Germans, it was kind of like death by 1,000 cuts, but they were all happening at the same time. And the net result was that people were saying, we have nothing here, we have no work, we have no means of getting work, the economy's flat, what are we going to do? Here was the other part that they dealt with, which was the return of all these little mini monarchs. I was profoundly moved by the terrible devastations in southern Germany and by the plight of farmers in Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria. I had not known that German princes exploited and mistreated their subjects so ruthlessly merely to be able to afford another castle or hunting lodge for which to hunt deer and wild boar, or to pay for the maintenance of a small military force to protect them from their desperate subjects. These conditions must and will change. They didn't change. This is one, and I want you to do this in the context of Bruce County today and imagine what the reaction would be to all the farmers who are currently trying to get soybeans off or into the corn right now. The Prince's hunting parties were particularly hard on the rural population. 1 or 2 days of compulsory labor on such occasions was never enough. Farmers sometimes had to spend 3 or 4 weeks rounding up game and guarding it through long nights for the hunting pleasures of their overlords. Some farmers were obliged to travel for as long as 3 days without any compensation before they reached the Ducal Game Reserve. Exhausted, some of them with frostbite from the long vigil, they returned home with growing discontent. In one case, the civil service was asked to organize 21,584 farmers with 3,237 horses for hunting parties in a single season. In 1814, the Heidenheim district of Württemberg lost nearly 4,000 acres of untilled land for which, nevertheless, taxes had to be paid. because they were trampled by hunting parties. Try that here. You want me to be out there for a month in harvest? You want to run your horses over my bean field? I think we know what the answer would be. For these guys, the answer was yes, sir, because they own you. And anybody that thought otherwise, Solheim, you're a bit of a troublemaker. We don't like you guys doing that. I hear from your former landlord that you gave grief. I don't like troublemakers. I'll have my eye on you. And for these people, nobody got to say the words, why don't you get off your ass and do it yourself? Or if they were riding a horse, whatever it was. But the point was that for these people, you have no choice, you have no work, you have no future. And now, this guy's telling you that you're going to spend a month out chasing down a bunch of deer, and at the end of it, they trample your crop and say, but by the same time, you owe us taxes. So one of the other things that really came in, remember we talked before about the Russian campaign? In the aftermath of Napoleon's wars, compulsory military service, 3 years. A lot of people of German descent, my family especially, there was nothing. You never heard anything about where were you, did you leave people behind, what, did you have family there, did you leave your parents, how did that feel? Nothing. It's like they pulled the door closed and they never spoke of it again. A good portion of that was simply because they left illegally. If you left the country and you were of military age, you were supposed to get a permit. If you didn't have the permit, you couldn't go. So a lot of them scampered through Le Havre. The French weren't terribly concerned about that same kind of enforcement. So over half the Germans that went out to the New World went through Le Havre. The compulsory military service had something else. Those 80,000 German mothers whose kids had gone into Russia 5 years before remembered what happened. And they said, that's not happening to my family. So one of the big things you hear about when the Germans first came out, in addition to the economic part, was we're not doing anything more. If you had 25 years worth of wars, what's the expectation? We're going to have more wars. The one thing that was striking about it was when the Germans came out to North America, 3 million went to the United States. 50,000 came to Canada. 3 million, 50,000. Why is that? Canada got a bit of a bad rap as far as climate went. These are some of the pictures that were featured in Canada at the time, all rather nice. Here's a nice one. And you know, they also listened to the Weather Network, and they have made an announcement that when Highway 21 is built, it's going to be closed. So they took a look at Canada and said, maybe not. But for the 50,000 who came, that's us. This was a letter that I found from somebody who moved out, I think 1829, Frederick Lease. At sunrise, we moved out heavily laden in the typical manner of migrants with heavy steps as if a funeral procession, as though we feared to reach the German border too soon. Those of us who were parents sat with dark thoughts. We were about to leave Germany and everything dear to us, with the possible risk of having to commit the body of one of our little ones to the waves, or the heart-rending prospect of dying before their eyes and leaving them unprotected in the new world. And we sat there in anguish, alone with our thoughts, not daring to look up for fear of betraying our innermost doubts. It was then that the children broke into song, and we'll let you figure that out. Arise, ye brothers, and be resolute, we journey over land and sea to North America. At this point, it became impossible to conceal our agony any longer. It was one of the most radiant spring mornings I have ever seen. The sun had just cast its first beams on the paradisal regions of the Palatinate. The prospect proved a balm to our agony, and soon we raised our voices in joyful song, all the remembered strains of Schiller and Oden's Comically Beautiful, and so I left my native town. Onlookers must have taken us for people of quality rather than evicted emigrants. I do this, and I do the spouse test, okay? I'm going to go to my wife and say, I think we should go out to Canada. Good chance that one of our kids will die, or will die, and they'll be on their own. And what do you think about that? And the answer in today's world would be, are you out of your mind? We're not doing that. But these weren't people with a choice. This was why they came. This was not about them saying, we have a better life someplace else. They knew the risks. But this was a better risk than dying of starvation at home. So that's kind of, in one sense, it's kind of like the Scots and the Irish. We're all economic fugitives here, and this is how their part of it went. This is something for my 3 greats grandfather, Philip Fisher. He was from Baden. In 1836, he got a permit, or he got a letter of introduction from the parish priest in Onsbach, testifying that they were in good standing. Here are the names of the 3 children, and for an introduction to whoever they came over. 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, that generation was going, and where were they going? They were going to New Germany. That particular group was looking at Waterloo County, and specifically there were parts of Waterloo County that had not been yet settled or were marginally settled. By the time a lot of the later ones came, they were full up, which is why we have all of you in the Bruce County area now. This shows a typical German ship of a later period. As you can see, it's steam. When they were looking at this, part of what they looked at was a lot of the vessels were small. When you're coming across the North Atlantic, it all sounds, well, that's okay, we came across the North Atlantic. We're talking about waves going down 40 feet. We're talking about when that ship hits bottom, is it actually going to rise again? And these people are coming, again, in the millions to the States, 50,000 to Canada, because there is no choice. This is I read this mid-1750s. During the voyage, there's on board these ships terrible misery, stench, fumes, horror, vomiting, many kinds of seasickness, fever, dysentery, headache, heat, constipation, boils, scurvy, cancer, mouth rot, and the like, all of which come from the old and sharply salted food and meat, also from some very bad and foul water, so that many died miserably. Sounds like a great promotion, if you were sort of, take the sea cruise, 8 glorious weeks on the North Atlantic. Add to this want of provisions, hunger, thirst, frost, heat, dampness. The lice abound so frightfully, especially on sick people, that they can be scraped off the body. The misery reaches a climax when a gale rages for 2 or 3 nights and days, so that everyone believes that the ship will go to the bottom, and with all human beings on board, in such a visitation, the people cry and pray most piteously. One of the things that happen when you're in these ships, when the storm hits, they batten down the hatches. They shut it down. It is dark in there. You can't see anything. And if you're in there for 2 or 3 days, you don't have food, you don't have water, you ride it out. No one can have any idea of the sufferings which women in confinement have to bear with their innocent children on board these ships. Few of this class escape with their lives. Many a mother is cast into the water with her child as soon as she is dead. One day, just as we had a heavy gale, a woman in our ship who was to give birth and could not give birth under the circumstances was pushed through a loophole in the ship and dropped into the sea because she was far in the rear of the ship and could not be brought forward. Okay? That's the reality of coming across, and still they came. They knew this when they were coming out. This is a letter from 1831. We spent 51 days crossing the ocean, and time was long, but when we saw land in New York, we could not get enough of the sight. Everything was so beautiful. When we arrived at New York Harbor, the captain of the ship demanded an extra $2 for each of us before relinquishing our personal effects. Imagine, people ripping off immigrants. We went to see the German captain who later guided us to Buffalo. He went to the police with us and arranged for us not to pay the requested sum. That made us very happy, but the ship's captain became extremely annoyed and said, in half an hour's time, everything has to clear the ship. Did we ever work? In a quarter of an hour, everything had been uploaded. Our ship was 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. It was a small one, but all went well. From New York, we went to Buffalo and Albany by steamer. Then we boarded another boat that was pulled by horses. In this fashion, we went by water uphill. They're talking about the Erie Canal. So if you're the 1820, 1830, 1840 German crowd, what's happening is you're landing in New York, and then you're going up the Erie Canal. And then find your way via Buffalo across and up to Waterloo County. This talks about another fellow's experience. It's just the timing. This is a fellow, 1847, they're starting to have people coming out to Quebec instead of down to New York. So he's talking about the fact, went on board 12th of June. The timing is the important part here. They sailed on the 14th of June, they didn't get to Quebec till the 6th of August. They took a steamboat from Montreal because at that point the river's shallow and they can't take the big boats up from go back up to Montreal. So they take the steamer. They, 4 o'clock in the evening, from thence to Hamilton. Team on the 12th, 10 o'clock started for London, 90 miles away, and reached Brothers on the 14th at 4 o'clock. Brother and cousins rejoiced to see us living, but on the 17th, the child Margaret died, being worn out on the journey and up the country in the boats and the wagon, the most fatiguing of all. James was the stoutest of us all. I was seasick all the way. Can you imagine? Seasick all those days. That was then. This is Jane White. She was from Goderich, same kind of thing. She's talking about, without going through the whole part, talking about wasn't sure the ship was going to rise. She did rise, thank God, and very shortly after we picked up the crew of a schooner that the same gale had broken to pieces. She had her broadside actually driven in by the sea. Such gales are dreadful. Our captain had been about 20 years at sea and confessed we had seen as much desperate weather as he had seen in his time. Great number of ships have been lost in the ice here early in the spring. One was wrecked in the Gulf of St. Lawrence here during the gales. Contained 400 passengers who all perished except one child who was picked up by a vessel. And still they came. The reason most people came to this area had a lot to do with this guy. This is Joseph Brant. Brant Township named after him. Big supporter of the British during the American War of Independence. His Six Nations warriors were formidable, and they basically kept things in check for the British through most of that time. After the war was over, the Six Nations was fragmented. Some units had stayed behind and worked with the Americans. His bunch had not, and they'd been rather effective, so they chose to come to Canada. Canadian government at the time, the British government, said, we've got a place for you, Grand River, 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, all the way up to Fergus. Good, except nobody asked Six Nations whether they actually wanted to be farmers or not. And they said, we'd rather not. We'll take ours here and we will sell the rest of the land. One of the people that bought up part of the land was a speculator by the name of Richard Beasley. Now, Beasley comes across as not terribly sympathetic. The Mennonite people had experienced difficulties during the American Revolutionary War as well. Mennonites and Amish were non-combatants. Everybody says, but you have to fight. Well, no, we're not going to fight. Well, we're going to penalize you because you didn't. The net result was that we had a group of Mennonites came up 1799 to check out this land around the Grand River. What did they come to look for? The black walnut. If black walnut grows here, this is good soil. So they came and they bought land from this guy Beasley, and a couple curious things happened. Number one, he failed to disclose that he had 2 partners. And the other part was he had a mortgage on his place. So when they found that out, they kind of went to him and he did the honorable thing. He didn't say anything. He sure as heck didn't give the money back. So he said, I got a deal for you. You give me another $10,000 and you can have 60,000 acres more of land. Because other than that, you just lost your money. So the Mennonite group started coming from Pennsylvania in 1807. And the way they did it, think about the time. They have to transport $10,000 and it all has to be in silver. The difficulty is there's no banks. You don't get to say, well, here's my bank draft, here you go, that's the 5,000. So they had to bring the money up in kind. So what they did was they took all the silver and the first bunch they sewed into a bunch of quilts and they brought that up. The second bunch, they had a keg with 5,000 coins in it. So there were 5 guys, 4 of them went around the periphery, that's how they slept. The 5th guy slept on the keg. And that's how they delivered the goods to Beasley. They got the money, they got the land, and they started bringing things up on their Conestoga wagons in the 1807. They continued to come into the 1830s, but by no means that they used up all the land. Some came on foot or horseback, most traveled in the large horse or ox-driven Conestoga wagons. Can you imagine coming up over trails where there's no mountain, where there's no actual highways, through the Allegheny Mountains. At Niagara, they caulked the seams of their wagons and used them as boats. It took a week to penetrate the Beverly Swamp. Beverly Swamp, if you come up over Hamilton Hill and you're heading up number 6, Beverly Swamp is about 5 miles in. Ancaster is kind of the last place, and then you got the swamp. And you would have, loads would be tipped. Teamsters hated it, but it also provided them to be isolated from anybody else. So they came to Waterloo, so they're 35 miles in, back and beyond. There's nobody near them, they own the land. Here's how it went. Here's the recreation of that. You might recognize the name. Ronald Reagan played all of our ancestors, by the way. So what was happening was, at the same time, all these Germans were landing in the States, and things were pretty much the same then as they are now. There were a lot of people who were very hostile to new immigrants. All these guys wanted was, give us some land, let us work, let us create our own way. But the basic conclusion was the last good people that came into this country were us, and everybody since then isn't. So this is something that happened in the States in recent times. You want to be in America? When you're here, let's speak American. You'll hear a lot about the Americans being concerned about Hispanics taking over, and Spanish is going to be the main language in the States. In the 1840s and 50s, the fear was it was going to be German. The other part was that in terms of today's world, the people we fear are Muslims. In those days, it was Catholics. So if you were a German Catholic coming to this area at those times, it'd kind of be the equivalent of a Honduran Muslim coming today. There were parts where you weren't welcome. Now this is one where it happily blends both traditions in my family. We have the Germans in the lager on the one side and the Irish in the whiskey in the other, and they're both stealing the ballot box. So that's kind of tells you where we're at. With the times, just to give you an idea of just how fraught it was, in 1854, the Washington Monument's being put up in Washington, D.C. In the middle of the night, a group comes in, they poison the guard dog, they tie up the watchman at gunpoint, they take out this marble piece, they smash it into small bits, they put it into a rowboat, they row it out to the middle of the Potomac River, and they dump it all. The reason? It was a donation by Pius IX, and they weren't having any damn Catholic stuff in a memorial. That was the period, that was the sensation. It wasn't universal, there were, but a lot of the people coming to the New World, it wasn't all that welcoming. The other one I'll talk about, in Philadelphia in 1844, the word got around that the Catholics were trying to suppress anybody teaching the Gospels at school, the Bible. And the word got around. They had 2 riots, one in May, one in July. They burned out 300 Catholic homes. They chased them through a church, they burned the church. 5,000 militia come out. They are firing cannon at each other. Of the militia, 30 people died and another 50 wounded. But it sort of gave the sense of just how fraught those relations were at the time. The interesting part, in New York, there was a guy, he was the Archbishop, his name was John Hughes. John went to the mayor and said, I'm a little concerned about the churches. And he said, well, do what you can, but it's kind of like, ha ha ha, if it falls down or burns down, that's too bad. Whereupon Hughes said, if one of my churches burns, we will make New York into another Moscow. You remember the French burned all of Moscow 30 years before? And at that point, the Irish all put the matches back in their pocket and acted innocent. But that was what it took. But at the time, nobody burned any churches in New York. But that's kind of what it was like for the people coming here. So we have somebody that came here, Carrick, his name was Michael Fisher. He found out about New Germany in New Orleans. So he passes 15,000 farms all the way up here. And he comes here to settle. Why? They spoke German. You were welcome. It was like being home. And for a lot of those people, this was great. This was the other part of it. We're going to come back to this. The attitude to the Germans wasn't friendly. To the Irish, it was downright hostile. That's us on the right. You can notice the simian features. Everybody got that. The Irish are apes. We'll come back to that later. So here's Waterloo County. This is where they were settling. This is one of the fellows who had been here a while. And why did they bring him out? When you receive this letter, please write to us by return mail whether you intend to come or not and what news there is. We've heard there's another war over there. We do not have to be afraid of war over here. Everyone is free. Much money can be earned. You can make money easy as you can make hay if you only want to work for it. Now, I do not know what else to write, so I remain your very best. You send a letter like that back to Alsace. You send it back to any of those places in Germany, and more people come. We all have pictures in our attics, and the expectation is that the people who came to the Bruce, by and large, had this kind of look. If you have a picture around home someplace, nobody's smiling, he looks severe, she looks more severe because she spent 40 years with him. And that was kind of the thing. But in point of fact, the people that came out here, especially the group that came from Waterloo County, they didn't have to. Their parents had already been here for 20 years. They were already settled. They already were in a place where you had, roads and schools and highways, and you had hospitals, and instead, they came to the Bruce. A little bit more like this. These are the kind of people who say, you know what? The fact that we have nothing but trees and we have no facilities of any kind, we're going to have to work for 20 years to clear the land. We will have no money in that time because there's nothing to sell. If we harvest the wheat, where are we going to sell it? All we're going to do is exist. And if we're lucky, our kids may have something down the way. So this guy on the right here, I think, may be a relative. Here's what they were facing. Wanted settlers for 250,000 acres of farmland. Housing nil, running water nil, washing and cooking facilities nil, food whatever you can pack in, catch or shoot. Toilet facilities some distance from the house once you get it built. Healthcare facilities non-existent, mortality rates high, must be willing to work 80-hour weeks without break for a minimum of 10 years for a bare subsistence and very little prospect of profit. Working knowledge of all aspects of spinning, weaving, sewing, knitting, house construction and maintenance an absolute necessity. For people with families, there are no schools and very limited contact with the outside world or the family you left behind. Convenient 3-day stroll from nearby small town, provide shop supply kerosene for light, cloth for clothing, flour for the bread you will be expected to make every day but Sunday. Applicants should anticipate long bouts of cabin fever during the 5 months of winter and snow accumulations on unplowed roads of 10 to 12 feet annually. And they came in the thousands. They couldn't wait. In fact, their concern was, we're going to miss out. And what they called it down there, soggy fever. They couldn't wait. And all that generation of German kids, the kids, 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds, 25-year-olds, this is what they signed up for. One story from my family, and the thing is, it wasn't unique, it was fairly common, but at the same time, it sort of tells you how extraordinary these people were. Jacob Wader had 200-pound bags of wheat, which he carried 70 miles to Guelph. So what you do is you carry 100 feet, then you go back and do it again, then you take the other 100. So 70 miles to Guelph, he's traveled 210 miles. 140 of that, he's carrying 100 pounds. Then he comes back with flour and presumably a few little goodies of whatever he has along the way. He finally arrives in 3 weeks later, and his wife says, "Did you remember the vanilla?" And if he's like me, he probably didn't, In any event, that wasn't uncommon. That's what you did. So, extraordinary people. This kind of describes soggy fever. We'll get sort of the thing going here.
I don't want to. Our plantation don't mean anything when...
Do you mean to tell me, Katie Scarlett O'Hara, that land doesn't mean anything to you? Why, land is the only thing in the world worth working for, worth fighting for, worth dying for. Because it's the only thing that lasts.
Oh, Paul, you talk like an Irish.
It's proud I am that I'm Irish. And don't you be forgetting, Missy, that you're half Irish too. And to anyone with a drop of Irish blood in them, why, the land they live on is like their mother. Oh, but there. No, you're just a child. It'll come to you, this love of the land. There's no getting away from it if you're Irish.
Translate that into German, because it's the love of the land. And why is it? Because I've got independence. I don't have to answer to anybody. I don't have to serve in the army. I don't have to do anything. Paul Kane did pictures of Bruce County prior to the arrival. This is what it looked like just before. So uncleared land, small settlements, native settlements. This is what they came to. So it talks about the fact that the Germans were second generation. A lot of them came from New Germany, which is Maryhill, Wellesley Village. Prior experiences, when the weather was staying cold, we did not know how to keep ourselves warm. So while we roasted our eyes out before the fire, our backs were freezing. So first we turned one side and then the other, just as you would roast a goose on a spit. Mother spent half the money father earned on whiskey to keep us warm. But I do think a larger mess of good hot potatoes would have kept us warmer than whiskey did. It talked about the pioneer experience. I had a guy from Greenock Township brought this into me. Do I know what it is? No, I didn't. This is from somebody who had a log cabin. He blew his own glass. Now, how do you do that? You know, where do you learn to do that? The place would have been dark. It would have been like a cave. And this guy was sufficiently motivated to blow his own glass to make a little more light come in. And it gives you another sense, because you think about the log cabin as being something warm and hospitable. But it was dark, and for the people that lived there, more than a little bit, in addition to cold, downright depressing. This is one I've used before, but it talks about the experiences of the first settlers. The part here at the end, Mrs. Crean, and she could be Schmidt, Mueller, Meyer, talking about the fact that you don't regret having come here. Indeed, then, no, sir, not a bit. Thanks to the Lord, and blessed be his holy name, we have plenty to eat and drink and a good bed to lie on, and no one to take it from us or say boo to us. The grief I have is that there's only 200 acres. And sir, if you happen to go to Galway and see the landlord, you may tell him from me that I'm better off than himself and more independent in my mind, and tell him all the harm I wish him is for him to know that much. I like Mrs. Crean, but that was the point. What brought them? Independence, freedom. What drove them to do the kinds of things that they did? This is what motivated them, because they finally could break free. They didn't have to account to the landlord. They didn't have to do the hunting party. They didn't have to do any of that. And so for them, this was a paradise. So what did the Germans do when they came here? They built. Try it one more time.
This is right. Right down.
And I'll have to ask you to turn your minds. We're about to watch a phantom barn raising, and we're going to see those sections come up. So if you've ever seen the movie Witness, that's what this scene is from. And these are some of the things that people were building. So, and it was constant, and the work, and all of these places were thriving because people were working hard. Familiar place in Mildmay. This is the actual King Ludwig that was referred to earlier. This is in his earlier days, the sponsor of Formosa Church. This is Father de Stier. He's the gentleman who wrote him on 2 occasions and got him to contribute money to the church. Ludwig sort of bankrupted Bavaria and sort of got booted off the throne. He still existed for a number of years afterwards, and he contributed of his personal funds to make Formosa Church happen. Here's an early picture of the church. You can see that the trees are barely planted around it. You can see the trees starting to come up in the picture here, and the most recent, and the interior. And they built it for a much larger congregation or something to accommodate to the greater glory of God. And look what they did. This is from the stone carvers, of course. It was set here in Formosa. They refer to it as Schönval, beautiful valley. Formosa, Latin for beautiful. This is kind of an epitaph, and it's kind of sad about Father Gestur and King Ludwig. He didn't know, therefore, that 8 months later, while the bishop was blessing the safely installed Schönval bell, King Ludwig of Bavaria was forcibly removed from his palace at Neuschwanstein and driven to Schlossberg. Declared insane and placed under house arrest, the plump and now mostly toothless monarch hoped for a peasant uprising to set him free, but the peasants, though fond of their king, were too pragmatic and too overworked to revolt. 24 hours later, while Father Gestur's congregation lit candles of gratitude and said prayers for the continued health of the ruler who contributed so generously to the construction of one priest's dream in the wilderness, the deposed King Ludwig walked into the lake of Schlossberg and drowned. He left in his wake some effusive castles, a number of highly imaginative follies, operas by Wagner that would never have been created, let alone performed, without his financial and moral assistance, and one marvelous church in the wilds of Canada, his connection to which would be entirely forgotten. Maybe not entirely. Here's one of his places. Broke Bavaria at the time, now is the top tourist attraction in Neuschwanstein. One of the people who came to the area was my 3 greats grandfather, Anthony Vogt. Came to this country in 1841, settling in New Germany, married Marie Anne Schur. The fruits of his marriage were 15 children, 14 of whom still live, and 12 of whom attended their father's funeral. Mr. Vogt lived to see 145 grandchildren and 57 great-grandchildren, making a total of 217, probably the largest line of descendants possessed by any man in Ontario. How did he die? Just because you're 86 doesn't mean you quit working. You know, no one's going to let you dog it. He fell off a ladder. And I'm pretty sure that if we go back far enough, if you're from South Bruce and your people came up around the same time mine did, if you're not connected to Anthony Vogt, it's some kind of miracle. This is an apology written in part afterwards, and they're talking about the traits of Germans generally. We're not talking just, he wrote about the Catholics, but it applies across the board. To a great extent, preserve their national traits. They're frugal, work hard, are thrifty, and orderly. Traveling through these settlements, you'll notice good farm buildings in good state of repair, and everything looked tidy and in place. Let's remember that, because this is about to change. This is also from the stone carvers, and we won't go through the whole thing, but it'll talk about the fact that prior to the First World War, German immigrants, the sons and daughters of the country Canada was now preparing to fight, were held in highest esteem. Their cleanliness, blonde hair, clear eyes made them a welcome addition to Canada. The Irish, not so much, and that's about to change. This is what my grandmother, we're going to revisit her back in the woodshed now. 1914 was a terrible year. Her father died. There he is, I believe that says November, I don't know, 1914. And the First War broke out. Now the problem was that for some of the German-speaking children, if everybody else in the area was German-speaking, it wasn't just too terribly bad. In Eden Grove, Ontario, you're the only German-speaking family at a time when things have gotten very bad. And think of it this way. If your kid is at high school and they're being bullied, you go to the church, you go to the school, you talk to the principal, you say, hey, there's a problem here. If possible, you might go to the parents of whoever's doing the bullying and try and sort it out. For a lot of the Germans in the First World War, the bullying went on for 4 years. And not only that, but it was not just the kids, but the parents that were at home, but it was also the Canadian government that was fomenting this kind of thing. And the curious part was this, the Germans, the earliest of whom would have been the Mennonites, at this point had been here for 115 years. the Germans who were in South Bruce, by and large, have been here 75 or 80 years. So they're third generation. The other part was that these are their neighbors. So they have all this people that they've been living with, sharing with, whatever else, and suddenly their neighbors are turning on them for no reason. It's not like somebody from Mildly went into town and, you know, burned down 5 houses and went back home. It's because suddenly the word went out that if you were German, every single German was evil. And that came about as a result of the First World War. This is the Ludwig Kaufmann family. Shortly before his death, he left behind a widow and 11 kids, and they pretty well were on their own just at a very bad time. One of the things that happened, this is Kaiser Wilhelm. The Kaiser had an unfortunate problem. He was a little bit unhinged. He said things that people sort of said, did I hear that right? If I could compare the Kaiser, if you were to think of Don Cherry with an 11 million man army, that's kind of where we were at. So he said some things. What they did was the Germans went into Belgium and they had a heavy hand. They were trying to conquer France quickly, and they killed 6,000 civilians and they burned 25,000 houses. But that was one unit. There were 11 million people in the German army. Maybe 2,000 people, if they were guilty, put them through the processes. But by process of some rather unpleasant propaganda, that attached to everybody. Talk to you about something of what happens when you have something like a war.
In 2003, in order to show their displeasure with the French for not supporting the Iraq War, Tommy Cortopazzi and Tim Wright poured out $1,000 worth of French wine in front of their Reno, Nevada restaurant. They wanted to pour the wine into the gutter, but that was against the city ordinance, so instead they decided to pour it into a bucket and then poured that down the drain.
Well, the Iraq debate continues to stir emotions and protests around the world. In Los Angeles this hour, supporters of the use of force plan to protest France's opposition to war by pouring bottles of French wine in the gutter outside of the French consulate.
Tim and Tommy seem to have started a symbolic revolution. Protesters from Young Americans for Freedom poured bottles of wine in the gutter in front of the French consulates in Los Angeles and Manhattan at the same time.
Quite a discussion with the way the French have turned this into an anti-American affair. I think that we need to support America, support our troops, and all the people who are against America. We need to show that there's still support out there for what President Bush is doing.
The key to the Boston Tea Party that made it both daring and dramatic was that the tea was in fact stolen. This little detail was apparently lost on legions of anti-French protesters. By buying perfectly good French wine.
So the point is this: in time of war, people are afraid. First casualty of war is the truth. The second one is any kind of rational behavior. And people basically lost their minds. I'm going to abridge a little bit of this. The issue that became important for the people here, Woodrow Wilson became the American president in November of 1916. He campaigned on a platform of saying he kept us out of the war. The Americans were ambivalent. They didn't want to go to war. They didn't want to fight. The only problem was it looked like the Germans were winning. The British had lost 650,000 people at the Somme. The French had lost another 400,000 at Verdun. And the Russians looked like they were about to collapse. So here we are. God bless Wilson. Peace in America. 6 months later, he is in a position where he needs to encourage Americans to go into a war that he didn't want to go into. Here's part of the sentiment. This is in 1914, first year of the war.
We were talking about a ceasefire. I don't think anyone would criticize us for laying down our rifles on Christmas Eve. Smell it.
These are the mortal enemies. They've been fighting for 5 months. They've lost hundreds of thousands of people. And among the general people, there wasn't a whole lot among the soldiers in terms of hate. Enlistments were down, so you had to foment something to get people stirred up. One of the things in the United States, Germans were the largest group of people, 15.2% of the population. Irish are next, 10.8, African Americans, 8.8. This guy was put in charge of changing public opinion. So what he did was he started running all kinds of anti-German ads. He prevented anybody from doing anything the contrary. He worked with the post office and prevented anybody from shipping anything through that would counter it. In between movies, as they changed the reels, you heard about how terrible the Germans were. Not just anybody, all. You know, and in fact, if you were German, you were the enemy. You were, you know, Satan on earth. Here's what they were doing. These are the posters that from the Times. Cutting off hands, murdering a nurse, swap the brutes with Liberty bonds, my German heroes bombing Red Cross hospitals, babies. This was all from government. This is something that was put out by the Canadians, by the Americans. Destroy this mad brute. And if you happen to be one of the German people here, you kept your head low. If somebody had a sense of humor, obviously they got tired of all the German atrocities, so here are more sauerkraut, Limburger cheese, and bloodwurst. More German atrocities. Before and after. Johann Schmidt, after the war, John Smith. Sauerkraut, pickles. Notice that even the dog changes. It's not a dachshund anymore, it's a little English terrier. Because that was the pressure that was put, and people talked at the time. This is Kitchener. That name changed because you couldn't be Berlin anymore. My grandmother talked about this. This is a tower that was at Crawford, Ontario, in Bentic. What they did was they constructed a tower to see the Kaiser's troops coming. The issue was, what exactly were they going to do if they saw them? The German army would have had to sail across, defeat the Royal Navy, come to Canada, Montreal, walk past Toronto, and suddenly they say, if we take Bentic Township, we have the whole country. Now, if I was one of those guys, you know, I could see it where you'd get 4 or 5 guys together, and you'd say, okay, we're going to pretend that we're going to make a tower, and we're going to go and play cards and drink beer, and after about 5 or 6 months, somebody from the building office is going to tell us we can't build a tower, and then we'll fold it all up, and we'll have a good winter. These guys actually built this, and my grandmother talked about the fact that there was, you know, these people were sufficiently terrified to make this happen. There's another one happened in Carrick, Lot 19, Concession 1, so just down from McIntosh. And the only difference was that one was built and it fell down. So if the Germans had been building it, it'd still be standing. But that was the fear. And the key to, I guess, everything else that happened, my grandmother talked about people being taken off the farms. 8 or 10 guys would show up, maybe in 2 cars. They'd take 2 or 3 young men in. They'd drive them into Walkerton. They would make them swear allegiance at the courthouse. And then they'd leave them to find their way back home. This all happened numerous times. And the tradition that became, the Germans basically kept their heads low, and that hasn't changed. One of the things, a cliche from the Second World War, was that if you had a movie, there'd always be somebody asking for the papers. Where's the papers? So this is kind of like a take on that.
Tickets, please. No ticket.
So parodying what was Hollywood cliche. Two things that tradition brings out. One being we have Oktoberfest and celebration. I don't think I have to show you how an Oktoberfest celebration works. I think you probably figured that out yourself. The last two things, and I'll show you this and we'll call it a day. The first one is sort of a test to see if there's anybody had snuck in here pretending to be German.
In time for Volksfest, everything has to be just perfect. 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 Volksfest is back with up to $5,000 off until October 31st. Perfect. In time for Volksfest, everything has to be just perfect. Heidi?
Perfect.
Perfect. Perfect. Volksfest is back with up to $5,000 off until October 31st. Perfect.
The final message, if you're German, you understand why you want to have that. Everything has to be perfect. That's it. Good.
Pat, on behalf of all of us here, thank you very much for an interesting and an entertaining thing. I think with immigration being in the forefront the way it is today, there's a lot of important messages that should come to us. All of us were immigrants. My Scottish family has similar stories of that, and so I think the message is very important. But it's also very important for us as the Bruce County Historical Society to remember our roots and how we got here and the hardships that people overcame to create this great place we call the Bruce. So thank you very much for coming, and inside this envelope is, I don't know what, but.
Thanks, Rob.